Welcome. The lesson is Development, Globalization and Society, and today's module is Globalization and the Challenge of Securing Livelihoods. In this, we are going to analyze globalization, understand what do we mean by sustainable livelihoods, and see what are the challenges that are there in securing sustainable livelihoods, and finally, talk about ensuring food security. We need to link globalization and livelihood to the issues of that how the process renders the marginalized people vulnerable and always at risk. Secondly, what do we mean by sustainable livelihood? What are the multiple strategies used by the marginalized people to secure their livelihood and struggle to make it sustainable within this precarious globalized world? Giddens argues that it is wrong to think of globalization as just concerning the big system like the world financial order. Globalization isn't about what is out there, remote and far away from the individual. In fact, it is an in-here phenomena too, influencing intimate and personal aspects of our lives. Thus, in this context, one could see that the macro policies affect and impact the everyday lives of the people, and they are caught in the larger social, economic, and political development. One such aspects refer to sustainable livelihood. It is critical to understand that analysis of the global requires necessarily a focus on the locally scaled practices and processes that are structured within the global dynamics. The module will examine to what extent the globalization process restructures the role of the state from welfare to sustaining economic growth. It would also examine the nature of sustainable livelihood. Moreover, it would highlight the precariousness of livelihood within a highly globalizing India. Moreover, it will examine the challenges of securing food security within a globalizing India. Anthony Giddens, in his seminal book, The Consequences of Modernity, defined globalization as the intensification of worldwide social relations which link distant localities in such a way that local happenings are shaped by events occurring many miles away and vice versa. Similarly, Held defined the process of globalization as the widening, deepening, and speeding up of the worldwide interconnectedness in all aspects of contemporary social life, from the cultural to the criminal, the financial to the spiritual. Globalization is a complex set of processes which includes a combination of political, technological, cultural as well as economic operating in contradictory ways. Subramaniam argues that globalization has to be viewed as a phenomena involving the local at one end and the global at the other end. It also involves a strengthening of social relations and institutions across space and time. Let's try and understand what do we mean by neoliberal globalization. Peters argues that contemporary globalization can be described as a package that deals which include informalization, application of information technology, flexibilization, destandardization in the organization of production and labor, and various changes such as regionalization and the reconfiguring of the states. Since the 1980s, the growing impact of neoliberal policies adds to the globalization package deregularization, financialization, and securitization, that is, conversion of tradable assets into tradable financial instruments, and the ideology of lean government. Thus, it is important to understand that this phase of globalization is different and much more challenging to deal with. Peters argues that during the neoliberal globalization, policies are a paradox, and it refers to as policy incoherence, primarily because institution matters but governments are rolled back, capacity building is the key but existing public capacities are defunded, accountability is essential but privatization eliminates accountability, the aim is building democracy by strengthening civil society but NGOs are professionalized and depoliticized, emphasis on labor market flexibility but it produces a growing part-time, casual and contractual workforce, and finally, development policy is a failure as it is a regime of financial discipline. In this context, let's examine the relationship between capitalism and labor. Any mode of capitalism has always made use of labor and all kinds of capital for maximization of profits. Eisenstein argues capitalism has always made use of women's productive and reproductive labor. What is happening now in the current phase of globalization is that, along with productive and reproductive labor, the system exploits women ideological and political labor through exploitation of the feminist ideal. One of the policies sustaining this era of globalization is the use of labor force. Chaudhary argues that an important aspect of the globalization process has been in the field of labor reorganization. One can observe a dramatic global restructuring based on cost competitiveness, which has become an important measure of forcing labor market regulation into strict rules and regulation that raise costs and adversely affect living and employment standards of the majority of the citizens worldwide. Globalization and development. Chaudhary states that the challenge of the process of globalization is that it has reshaped the meaning and connotation of the term, such as development, welfare, equality, economy, empowerment, and one can observe a selective appropriation of feminist findings, integration into mainstream development models for women. Additionally, it is the NGOs and the INGOs who collaborate with the state to implement and facilitate the implementation of the development program through public-private partnership. Thus, to address the process of globalization in India without locating the experiences of marginalized poor, women generally belong to scheduled caste, Dalit, and scheduled tribe at the core would be misleading. Continuing on similar veins, John argues that the new economic policy, international institution, and the state perceive women as good subjects, having great economic sense, including attributes such as hard worker, efficient and thrifty woman. We need to understand that globalization is restructuring the ways in which people are leading their lives. The process influences everyday life as much as it does events happening around the world on a large scale. One of the implications of the globalization is rendering livelihood precarious. In order to understand the process that renders livelihood precarious, we need to first engage with the concept of sustainable livelihood itself. As Regge states, I quote, "A theory of gender in the times of globalization has to contend with old questions of invisibility of gender and new questions of hypervisibility of market and of questions conceptualizing differences among women." One of the most widely accepted definitions include the one by Chambers and Conway. I quote, "A livelihood comprises the capabilities asset, including both material and social resources and activities required for means of living." Quote close. "A livelihood becomes sustainable when it can cope with and recover from stresses and shocks and maintain or enhance its capability and assets while not undermining the natural resource base." According to DFID, livelihoods are sustainable when they are resilient in the face of external shocks and stresses, are not dependent upon external support, maintain the long-term productivity of natural resources, do not undermine the livelihood or compromise the livelihood options open to others. The conceptualization of DFID livelihood approach is a leading framework used by the development practitioner. The livelihood approach of DFID urges that the higher level of policy development planning to be informed by insights gained at the local level. The livelihood outcomes that households achieve with their strategies are a result of all the processes, assets, vulnerabilities, policies, and institutions that either enhances or restrict their livelihood option. It is very important to recognize that factors at the cultural, societal, and institutional level impact the livelihood options of an individual and household. Laws, policies, cultural practices, and government institutions shape the way in which people support themselves. The sustainable livelihood framework, you can see in the diagram that the vulnerability context is related with transforming structure and processes. Moreover, the livelihood outcomes is dependent on livelihood assets. So through this model, we can understand the interdynamics that is underplay when we talk about sustainable livelihood. The figure in the previous slide very clearly reveals that the context of the vulnerability is important to understand while designing approaches. One needs to take into context household assets such as human, social, financial, physical, and natural available with the household so as to decide and develop a framework that would be sensitive to the range to assets available. Further, the policymakers should also recognize and take into cognizance the factor at the cultural, societal, institutional level that impact the livelihood of an individual or household. Thus, what is important is to understand that laws, policy, cultural practices, government institutions all shape the way people support themselves. Thus, one should take into contemplation policies, institutions, and practices affecting the livelihood options of a targeted participant. Let's now look at the critique of DFID livelihood framework. In the context of analyzing livelihood of women agricultural labor in India and understand household food security, Krishna Raj argues that DFID definition of sustainable livelihood does not adequately specify the composition of livelihood need. Thus, the means by which people earn their living have to be such that they provide them with basics: food, clothing, shelter, education, health, clean air, and water in quantities and qualities that ensure healthy lives function effectively in their social and personal life. It is important to understand the manner in which multiple patriarchies intersection lives of women in rural areas, particularly in the manner in which they structure unequal claim and rights to resources. These unequal claims, Krishna Raj argues, are experienced both at the site of production and consumption at the local level. The policymaker needs to recognize that household food security is contingent on many factors: the ability to grow enough for self-sufficiency among farming household and or having incomes to buy food. Therefore, commercialization process must have public intervention program to ensure food security of the vulnerable. Sustainable livelihood framework. Sustainable livelihood framework understands that livelihood are maintained through complex, intersecting decisions. People who are faced with livelihood challenge pursue a range of livelihood outcome, leading to health, income, reduce vulnerability by drawing upon a large range of assets. These processes are affected by their own preferences and priorities. Types of vulnerability including shocks such as drought and seasonal variation, determined by structures such as government or the private corporate sectors, processes such as institutional policies and culture. This is what renders sustainable livelihood approach to development so challenging, as it places people at the center of development both at the macro and micro level, and thus has to be designed in such a way that it builds onto other approaches. In the context of building rural livelihood, it is argued that the people combine multiple and different livelihood strategies such as agricultural intensification or extensification, livelihood diversification, and migration. These livelihood strategies are often heavily reliant on natural resource base. One needs to go beyond sectoral approach to rural development policy for sustainable livelihood. Thus, while designing policies for addressing rural livelihood, planners and policymakers should integrate agriculture, off-farm income generation, migration and remittances, and strengthen the rural-urban linkages. Using the example of scheduled tribe population of the country, particularly those whose livelihood is contingent upon forest-based produce, the module argues that maintaining sustainable livelihood is increasingly a major challenge. Nathan argues that one of the bases of economic growth has been the transformation of the hill forest economy. The forest produce such as minerals and waters are used for many development purposes such as increased power availability, irrigated water to increase agricultural productivity, and development of industrial base. But the major problem is that the benefits are experienced by people of plains and workers and not the scheduled tribe whose livelihoods were threatened. The people of the hill region, the scheduled tribe, Nathan argues, experience involuntary displacement and destruction of traditional livelihood through mining programs and irrigation policies such as building large dams. The development policies followed by the government come at a great cost to the marginalized people. The policy of compensation based on the value of the land decreases in value by the time it reaches the dispossessed people. It is an insufficient livelihood compensation. Similarly, analyzing the social and economic condition of tribes in the Indian state of Odisha, Pathi argues that they experience precarious lives conditioned by continuous indebtedness, bonded labor, poverty, and malnutrition. What are the approaches of the project and the policies when we talk about sustainable livelihood? Pathi argues that the project are designed from a top-down approach that is not sensitive to the local condition and the traditional ethos, economic and ecological context, and thus the project has no space for the voice of the tribes. According to Pathi, the project invested in agriculture production, natural resource development, human resource development, rural infrastructure, commercial development, and land survey, and implementation of management support. The appraisal mission emphasized on the human resource development of the target group, that is the tribal people, as they were illiterate, and so according to the IFAD mission, they practice primitive modes of survival, shifting cultivation, who have to change to opt for complexities of development program. Pathy states that such an approach has flaws as it does not take into consideration the agricultural practices followed by tribes are in relation to the land structure, soil component, and the control over the land. The fact that the tribes have to practice their agriculture on hill slope is also because the lowland plain is not only less but also owned by the non-tribal population. So any practice followed by the tribes are in the context of their resource availability. Such insights, argues Pathy, are not referred to within the mission plan. Thus, whatever programs are implemented, they do not help in the development of the people in the region for which they have become destitute today in their own area, deprived of their own basic right over their livelihood pattern. Further, due to the presence of a number of contractors and suppliers, particularly non-tribal, no significant intervention in terms of increase in income and sustainable agricultural productivity has been achieved. An important aspect of all livelihood security is food security. Let's try and understand how we can ensure food security. At its core, food security is a question of ability to access food for all the people at all the times, and thus very much goes beyond production, availability, and demand for food. Therefore, food security is dependent on three interrelated things: availability, accessibility, and affordability. Whereas availability and affordability relates to the processes of production and distribution, the question of accessibility is linked to Amartya Sen's concept of endowment and exchange entitlements. That is the resource at one's disposal that determines one's capacity to buy food. It is important to understand that the production and productivity in agriculture have been deeply affected by macro policies. For example, in India, the average size of land holding is around 0.2 hectare, and thus solutions to enhance productivity are not at all easy. Further, the presence of contract farming that emphasizes cash crops based on market-oriented crop pose great risk to household food security. Thus, Krishnaraj argues that in these times of uncertainty, the challenge is to use innovative alternative for agriculture, ensuring livelihood of poor women, and for food security that does not pull all its resources in monoculture baskets. Kannan argued that increase in food prices, shrinkages of area under food grain, and increase in food subsidy have merged as major concerns for food security. It determines one's capacity to buy food. What is the role of global market in defining India's food security? Let us examine the various facets underlying these themes. It is important to recognize that structural changes in the global grain market threaten India's food security. The prices are increasing due to both demand and supply issues. On the demand side, the use of the grains and other agricultural products to produce biofuel such as ethanol and biodiesel shift in the dietary patterns towards livestock, and high-value agricultural products are occurring. On the supply side, the world production of cereal has remained stagnant, whereas population is increasing. An increase in price of crude oil has raised the cost of production of agricultural products substantially. Thus, any jump in global prices pose a great challenge to food security in India. It is important to recognize that food production in India has not kept pace with the growth in population and demand. The reasons include ecological stress, diversification of land under food grain to non-agricultural activity, and shift towards cash crop that is more profitable. Moreover, crop yield globally has decreased in many areas because of declining investment in research and infrastructure, irrigation, and increasing water scarcity. Further, climate change in developing countries, especially in warmer tropical ones, experiencing intense rainfall between prolonged dry spell as well as reduced water resources for irrigation, have all led to diseases on crop and livestock pests, soil erosion, and desertification. What is the status of food security in India? Kannan argued that food security in India is in a precarious state, and at present the level of food grain production may not be sufficient to meet the growing demands in the coming decades. Swaminathan states that there are four major forms of government intervention in the food grain market in India to ensure minimum level of food security in India. These are system of procurement of food grain and of support prices for the major food grain and selected commodity, food stock managed by state through food shortage and buffer stock operation, state guided system of delivery of cheap food through public distribution system, government intervention in trade by setting up legal control on hoarding and other aspects of internal trade. Patnaik argues that the deflationary reform policy implemented by the government has brought the question of poverty and food security to the forefront. According to Patnaik, deflationary macroeconomic policy initiated by India is defined by sharp reduction in public planned development expenditure in rural areas, especially in agriculture, rural development, irrigation, and flood control. These policies are based on the assumption that public investment crowds out private investment. Deflationary reform policy include restraint on central government expenditure, limit on credit expansion, reduction of budget deficit to the GDP ratio has led to the following impact within the Indian economy. That is, reduction in the rates of investment in both capital formation and in social sector and reduced GDP growth and a negative impact on social factor. The impact of such policy decision manifests in slowing output growth, rising unemployment, unprecedented income deflation for the majority of cultivators and laborers, enmeshing of cultivators in unrepayable debt, and a loss of assets including land to the creditors. Further, it also leads to farmer suicide, fall in food grain absorption, and decline in average calorie intake in rural areas. Such policies, specifically Patnaik argues, are harmful for countries like India having irrigation dependent agriculture, thereby requiring high public investment. Commenting on the status on food security, Patnaik states that food crisis in India is a serious and widespread and is created by public policy which have been deflationary combined with trade liberalization when world primary prices are declining. Thus, opening up the Indian agriculture sector to the global market through full trade liberalization was, according to Patnaik, a very dangerous policy. Historically, it is argued that the growth of exports from tropical agriculture under free trade regime has always led to fall in domestic food grain output and availability, plunging the mass of population into deepening undernutrition and extreme cases, famine. PDS is a program to ensure food to the poor. Unfortunately, this scheme is operated with inefficiency and at huge cost with multiple leakages. Due to this, PDS is unable to ensure the delivery of food to the vulnerable socioeconomic groups and household. Under economic reform, the universal nature of PDS was changed to make it targeted so as to ensure that the identified poor could have access to the PDS program. The aim behind the revamped PDS was to improve access of poor household by increased coverage by proper targeting. PDS was just targeted to population in drought, desert, tribal, hilly, and urban slum areas. On the basis of the research in the state of Maharashtra, Swaminathan states that unfortunately, revamped PDS important failing was reduced entitlement and higher prices, leading to the fact that commodities sold by these outlets has fallen sharply. Thus, there are large gaps in the existing system of the delivery of subsidized food and large numbers of the income poor are excluded from the PDS. Post 1991, consumer food subsidies and PDS have come under attack, but PDS has to be genuinely reformed if it has to provide basic food security to the vast majority of the Indians' population. Let's try and understand the link between gender and food security. Krishna argues that food and livelihood security cannot be engendered without addressing the structural aspects of development. Further, in times of globalization, the Green Revolution approach cannot be transferred onto the existing farming system without being sensitive to the existing local regional concern of both social and ecological by nature. Gender scholars have long maintained that household is not a homogeneous entity where household factors influence the distribution of the resources. Women work within the household with fewer rights, higher work responsibility, and give higher contribution to household economy and food security. But this does not ensure food and nutrition security for them as individuals. Thus, Chaudhary and Parthasarathi state that it is important to acknowledge that household security does not ensure individual, especially women and children, in particular girl-child's security. Sen and Agrawal state that the reason is that women have weak bargaining power and weak fallback position, and most of the work performed by them is unpaid, obligatory, and invisible in nature. Chaudhary and Parthasarathi argued that though women's contribution to food security involves food production, food accessibility, and food utilization, they do not have rights to food security. Thus, it is extremely crucial that policy intervention be women-centric and must recognize the central role played by women in maintaining and stabilizing household food security. According to them, women are pivots of household security. On the whole, women are responsible for more than 70% of their family's food requirement. That too, if value is assessed as female wage rate, they play a crucial role in all the four pillars of food security, that is availability, accessibility, utilization, and stability of the excess. What needs to be done in the future? Needs policy and investment reform on multiple fronts needs to be addressed. Human resources, agriculture research, rural infrastructure, water resources, farm and community-based agriculture and natural resource management should be encouraged. In the Indian context, Kanan states that one needs greater public investment in research and development for improving supply of food grains and for ensuring sustainability of an efficient system of agriculture. It is extremely important to address the decrease in public investment in agriculture as a result of deflationary macroeconomic policies in the era of globalization. Such a policy, it believes, will surely increase agricultural production, boost income, and decrease poverty in rural area. Further, the growing degradation of land and water sources may require higher input and huge costs to maintain food production, thereby posing a threat to the food security. Kanan argues that one needs a strong research and development program to develop technologies that would enhance productivity of dry land agriculture, which would go a long way in securing food security within the country. So, coming to the conclusion, the module initially explained how globalization process places citizens around the world unequally. They are rendered vulnerable to the open market fluctuation with little fallback position and are exposed to seek the marginal and insecure livelihoods. Further, the module went on to examine the concept of livelihood and made an attempt to understand the various complex nature of sustainable livelihood. After establishing the concept of sustainable livelihood, the module examined how challenging it is for the marginalized poor to secure their livelihood. The final part of the module highlighted the complex way in which food security in the country is tied to the global market, making it highly vulnerable. In the end, I would like to conclude by saying that in the manner in which the deflationary macroeconomic policy renders the task of securing food security a Herculean task needs to be rethought. Particularly, securing and maintaining sustainable livelihood within a highly competitive economy should be geared towards maximizing greater profit with people at the center. The vulnerable and marginalized should occupy the center stage in formulating any livelihood issue. Thank you.